The scent of toasted bread and melting butter filled Sarah Mitchell's kitchen as she prepared school lunches. Outside, a typical Seattle morning painted everything in shades of gray and silver, while inside, the warm yellow lights cast a cozy glow over the granite countertops. The kitchen radio hummed quietly, a jazz station she'd started listening to recently, trying to develop tastes separate from David's. Her phone buzzed against the counter, screen lighting up with a text. She wiped peanut butter from her hands, expecting another work message from David about his late meeting. Instead, 3 short sentences shattered her world. "I'm not coming home. I've met someone else. I'm sorry." The knife she'd been using clattered against the counter, splattering peanut butter onto her cream sweater. 17 years of marriage, reduced to 23 words. "Mom?" Emma's voice carried down from upstairs, accompanied by the thud of dresser drawers. "Have you seen my blue cardigan? The one with the pearl buttons?" Sarah gripped the counter edge, willing her voice steady. "Check the laundry room, honey." She surprised herself with how normal she sounded, as if her husband hadn't just demolished their family via text message. The washing machine hummed in the background, such an ordinary sound for such an extraordinary moment. She glanced at the clock. 7:45 a.m. 15 minutes until she needed to drive the kids to school. 15 minutes to compose herself, to figure out how to pretend their world hadn't just imploded. Footsteps thundered down the stairs as Tyler, her 12-year-old, burst into the kitchen. His socks slid on the hardwood floors and he caught himself on the refrigerator door. "Mom, I totally forgot. I need to bring cookies for Mrs. Henderson's class party today." Sarah stared at her son, taking in features that mirrored David's. Those warm brown eyes, that crooked smile, even the way he ran his hand through his perpetually messy hair. Her chest tightened. "I'll drop some by at lunch," she managed, reaching out to smooth his cowlick. The morning proceeded with its usual chaos, finding Emma's cardigan behind the dryer, checking Tyler's math homework, ushering them both into her silver Honda CR-V. Sarah operated on autopilot, her mind spinning with questions. Where was David now? How long had he been planning this? Who was this someone else? As she pulled into the school drop-off lane, weaving between other parents, cars, Emma leaned forward from the back seat. "Is Dad coming to my recital tonight?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. The piano recital. Emma had been practicing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major for weeks. David had promised to be there. "Sweetheart," she began, then stopped. "How do you tell your children their father has abandoned them?" "Dad had to go away for work suddenly. We'll record it for him." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she couldn't bear to destroy their world before school. Not like this. Not the way David had destroyed hers with a text message at 7:43 a.m. on an ordinary Tuesday in October. The persistent drizzle that had plagued Seattle for the past week matched Sarah's mood perfectly. She sat in her home office, surrounded by the evidence of David's betrayal. Credit card statements revealing dinner reservations for 2 at Canlis, a restaurant too expensive for business meetings, charges from Tiffany & Co. on dates that hadn't yielded any gifts for her, hotel bookings at the Thompson, barely 15 minutes from their home. The rain tapped against her window in an irregular rhythm, like Morse code spelling out all her failures. A half-empty mug of coffee had gone cold beside her keyboard, her third attempt at breakfast that day. "Mrs. Mitchell." The voice startled her. Emma's piano teacher, Mrs. Chen, calling through the video chat window Sarah had forgotten to close. "About Emma's lessons." Sarah straightened in her chair, automatically smoothing her unwashed hair. Her reflection in the computer screen showed dark circles under her eyes that even the warm lighting couldn't hide. "Yes, of course. I'm so sorry about missing the payment this month. If we could just—" "Actually," Mrs. Chen interrupted gently, her kind face creased with concern. "I'm worried about Emma. She hasn't practiced in weeks. Today she just sat at the piano crying. When I asked about the Chopin piece, she said she never wanted to play it again." The words pierced Sarah's fog of self-pity. While she'd been drowning in her own pain, her children were struggling too. "I'll talk to her," she promised, ending the call quickly before her own tears could fall. Upstairs, Emma's room was dark, heavy curtains drawn against the gray afternoon. The space smelled of the vanilla body spray Emma had recently started using, trying to seem more grown up. Her 14-year-old daughter lay curled on her bed, Headphones on, back to the door. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, placing a hand on Emma's shoulder. "Go away," Emma mumbled, but she didn't pull away from her mother's touch. "I miss him too," Sarah whispered, her throat tight. Emma rolled over, her face streaked with tears, mascara creating dark smudges under her eyes. When had she started wearing makeup? "Jessica's dad left them last year," she said, voice breaking. "Now she only sees him on holidays, if he remembers. Is that going to happen to us?" Sarah wanted to promise it wouldn't, but David hadn't answered her calls in weeks. His absence at Tyler's soccer game last weekend had said more than words could. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I do know that we have each other." Later that night, after microwaving another dinner, no one really ate. Frozen lasagna that tasted like cardboard. Sarah found herself in front of the bathroom mirror. She hardly recognized the woman staring back at her. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her clothes hung loose on her frame. She'd lost 12 pounds without trying. David's voice echoed in her memory. "You've let yourself go." Had she? Was that why he'd left? She opened the medicine cabinet, reaching for the sleeping pills her doctor had prescribed. They helped her escape the nights, but the mornings still came, bringing with them the weight of decisions she couldn't postpone any longer. The mortgage payment was due next week. Tyler needed new soccer cleats. Emma's piano lessons. Sarah closed the cabinet without taking a pill. She couldn't keep hiding from reality. Tomorrow she would need to start figuring out how to move forward. But tonight, she just needed to breathe through the pain, to sit with the humiliation of being the woman whose husband left her for someone younger, someone who hadn't let herself go. The moment everything changed wasn't dramatic. It happened at Café Umbria, a small coffee shop in Pioneer Square, where Sarah had started going to avoid the Starbucks where she and David used to meet for lunch. The espresso machine hissed and steamed as Jenny, the barista with vibrant blue hair and kind eyes, told another customer about her mother's catering business. "She started with just family recipes and a dream," Jenny said, expertly creating a leaf pattern in a latte's foam. "Now she has 3 locations and a contract with Amazon's corporate offices." Sarah's hands tightened around her purse, where yet another rejection letter from potential employers sat unopened. 20 years of being a homemaker had left her with a resume gap that seemed impossible to overcome. But cooking, that was something she knew. The aroma of freshly ground coffee beans mingled with the scent of warm pastries, triggering memories of holiday baking. Her cookies had been legendary in the neighborhood, especially her grandmother's lavender shortbread, the recipe she'd perfected over years of practice. David used to brag about them at office parties, before he started finding reasons not to bring her along. That afternoon, instead of sending out more resumes, Sarah pulled out her grandmother's recipe box. Her hands trembled slightly as she sorted through the worn index cards, each one covered in familiar handwriting that had faded to a gentle sepia. The box smelled of vanilla and memories, with traces of flour still caught in its corners. "Mom!" Tyler's voice startled her. "What are you doing?" Sarah looked up at her son, really seeing him for the first time in months. He'd grown taller, his face a little leaner. He'd been carrying so much, trying to be the man of the house. "How would you feel about helping me start a business?" His eyes lit up with interest. "Really? What kind?" "Well," Sarah said, holding up the recipe box, "remember how everyone always loved Grandma Rose's cookies?" That evening, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with both kids, brainstorming names for their family business. Emma suggested Sweet Beginnings, and something about it felt right. Tyler offered to help with a website. Apparently, he'd been learning HTML in his computer class. For the first time since David's departure, the kitchen filled with laughter and purpose. They made test batches, deliberately burning one tray to see how bad they could make them taste. Even the failures felt like progress, filling the house with the comforting scent of butter and vanilla. After the kids went to bed, Sarah stayed up late, researching small business licenses, health department requirements, and cottage food laws. Her mind raced with possibilities. Farmers markets, online orders, local coffee shop partnerships. The path ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in months, she felt something like hope. The health department inspector adjusted his glasses as he reviewed Sarah's kitchen, his clipboard filling with notes that made her stomach clench. The November rain drummed against the windows, providing an ominous soundtrack to his scrutiny. "You'll need a 3-compartment sink," he said, tapping his pen against the clipboard. "Commercial-grade ventilation system, non-porous flooring, separate hand-washing station." His list continued, each requirement adding to the growing knot in Sarah's chest. After he left, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at the estimate, $12,000 for the necessary renovations. Her laptop displayed her banking account, where the divorce settlement sat untouched, money she'd earmarked for the kids' college funds. The cursor blinked over the transfer button as doubt crept in. "Mom?" Emma appeared in the doorway, clutching one of their test batch cookies. The lavender shortbread had become their signature recipe, perfected over weeks of trials. Jenny from Cafe Umbria called. "She says customers keep asking about these. She wants to know if you can make more. The sample boxes they distributed last week had been an experiment, just testing the waters." Sarah hadn't expected actual demand so soon. She looked at her daughter's hopeful face, then at the inspector's list. Some investments weren't just about money. The next 6 weeks transformed half their garage into a commercial kitchen. Sarah learned a new language. NSF certification, Chase CCP plans, liability insurance. Each requirement meant another dip into her savings, another moment of panic about failure. The space filled with professional equipment, stainless steel prep tables, industrial mixers, speed racks, that looked almost comically serious compared to her old KitchenAid. Tyler proved surprisingly business savvy for a 12-year-old. He sat at the new prep table one evening, homework spread beside a tray of cooling cookies. "We should do pre-orders only at first," he suggested, not looking up from his math. "That way we don't waste ingredients on cookies that might not sell." Sarah paused in her mixing, the whir of the industrial mixer dying down. When had her son gotten so practical? "That's actually brilliant, honey." Emma contributed too, spending hours at her desk designing packaging. Her artistic talent transformed simple craft paper boxes into something special, with a hand-drawn logo that captured the warmth they wanted their brand to convey. The first real order came from Cafe Umbria, 50 cookies a week, 3 varieties. Sarah spent the entire night before the first delivery, checking and rechecking every cookie, terrified of failing. As she loaded the boxes into her car at dawn, her hands shook not from caffeine but from fear. "They're just cookies," she whispered to herself. But they weren't. They were her future, her independence, her proof that David hadn't broken her completely. By the end of the first month, Sarah had developed a routine. Mornings for baking, starting at 5 a.m. when the world was still dark and quiet. The kitchen would warm up gradually, filling with the scent of butter and vanilla as Seattle awakened outside. Afternoons were for deliveries and paperwork, evenings for family time. The kids helped package cookies after homework, turning it into family time rather than child labor. They talked more during these sessions than they had in months. But success brought its own challenges. One evening, Sarah sat at her desk long after the kids had gone to bed, staring at order forms and ingredient costs. The numbers weren't adding up. She was selling more cookies than ever, but making less profit. Somewhere in her pricing strategy, something had gone wrong. The email from the Seattle Food and Wine Festival glowed on Sarah's screen, its implications both thrilling and terrifying. The invitation to be a vendor seemed too good to be true, and the required volume of cookies made her previous orders look like a child's bake sale. "You have to do it," Emma insisted, reading the email over her mother's shoulder. The early spring sun streamed through the kitchen windows, catching the flower motes dancing in the air. "This could be huge for us." Sarah looked at her daughter, noting how she said us instead of you. Somewhere along the way, Sweet Beginnings had become a family mission, rather than just her desperate attempt at survival. The festival preparation pushed them all to their limits. Sarah hired her first employee, a culinary student named Marcus, who brought fresh ideas and energy to the kitchen. He had a talent for flavor combinations that surprised her. His suggestion to add a hint of rosemary to their chocolate chip cookies had created their second best seller. But even with Marcus's help, Sarah found herself working 18-hour days. She fell into bed with flour in her hair and recipe variations swimming through her dreams. The scent of vanilla had become so constant that she barely noticed it anymore. 2 weeks before the festival, disaster struck. Their main vanilla supplier doubled their prices without warning, sending an apologetic email about supply chain issues in Madagascar. Sarah's carefully calculated profit margins threatened to crumble like overbaked cookies. She sat at the kitchen table past midnight, surrounded by competing supplier catalogs, when Tyler padded downstairs in his pajamas. The house was quiet, except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of late-night traffic on I-5. "Can't sleep?" he asked, sliding into the chair beside her. He'd grown 2 inches in the past few months, his face losing its childish roundness. Sarah managed a tired smile. "Just trying to solve a puzzle." Tyler picked up one of the catalogs, his fingers trailing over the pages. "Remember when Dad couldn't figure out his budget for the deck project? You fixed it by finding better deals on materials." The mention of David didn't sting like it used to. Instead, it reminded Sarah of her own resourcefulness, a quality she'd forgotten she possessed during her years of being just David's wife. The next morning, she drove to 3 different restaurant supply stores, negotiating deals and comparing prices. By day's end, she'd not only solved the vanilla crisis, but had also found better prices on several other ingredients. The festival itself tested every ounce of their preparation. On opening day, Sarah's hands shook as she arranged the display. Emma had designed their booth beautifully, with fairy lights and vintage cake stands. Tyler managed the square reader for payments like a professional, his voice confident as he explained their different varieties to customers. The first hour brought modest sales. The second hour brought a food blogger who Instagram storied their lavender shortbread. By hour 3, they had a line stretching past neighboring booths. "These are incredible," one woman said, buying 3 boxes. "Do you have a storefront?" "Not yet," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the "yet." When had she started thinking about expansion? They sold out by mid-afternoon. Sarah sent Marcus racing back to the kitchen to bake more, while she and the kids handled the growing crowd. She caught glimpses of competitors watching their booth, taking notes. For the first time, she felt like a real business owner, not just a divorced mom with a hobby. The Seattle spring had painted the city in cherry blossoms when Sarah received the email from Whole Foods Market. Their regional buyer had tasted Sweet Beginnings cookies at the festival and wanted to discuss a potential partnership. Sarah read the email 3 times, her hands trembling over the keyboard. "Mom!" Tyler's voice carried from the kitchen, where he was supposedly doing homework but probably sneaking cookie samples. "The new batch of lavender shortbread is ready for testing." Sarah found him at the prep table, surrounded by cooling racks and the comforting scent of butter and flowers. He'd arranged the cookies in neat rows, each one perfectly golden. When had her son become so meticulous? "Before you try them," he said, "I adjusted the baking time by 2 minutes. I think it makes them crispier around the edges while keeping the center soft." Sarah took a bite, closing her eyes as the flavors melded on her tongue. He was right. The texture was perfect. "Since when did you become such an expert baker?" Tyler shrugged, but his proud smile gave him away. "I've been paying attention." That evening, after the kitchen was clean and the next day's dough was chilling in the refrigerator, Sarah sat down with both kids to discuss the Whole Foods opportunity. The kitchen still held the day's warmth and the lingering scent of baked goods. "It would mean more equipment," she explained, watching their faces. "Longer hours. We'd need to hire more help." "We could handle it," Emma said, her voice confident. She'd recently started handling their social media, showing a natural talent for photography that made their cookies look like edible art. Sarah looked at her children, really looked at them. They'd grown so much in the past year, and not just physically. Emma had found her voice, Tyler his passion. What had started as their mother's desperate attempt at survival had become a family legacy in the making. The meeting with Whole Foods went better than she'd dared hope. The buyer, a woman named Janet with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, had already done her research. "Your story is compelling," Janet said, "but it's your product that sold me. That lavender shortbread? My wife ate an entire box in one sitting." They discussed numbers, distribution, scaling up. Sarah had done her homework, prepared for every question. When Janet slid the contract across the table, it felt like a victory lap. That night, Sarah stood in her commercial kitchen, no longer just half a garage but a real, thriving business space. The equipment gleamed under the overhead lights, and the air held the ghost of the day's baking. On the wall hung their first dollar bill, framed alongside the article from the local paper about their festival success. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Heard about Whole Foods. Congratulations. She read it once, then deleted it without responding. His opinion no longer defined her worth. Instead, she opened her grandmother's recipe box, now displayed proudly on a shelf above the prep station. The cards were laminated now, protected from flour and time, but they still held the essence of where everything began. She pulled out the lavender shortbread recipe, smiling at the familiar handwriting. "Mom?" Emma called from the office. "The photographer from Seattle magazine is confirmed for next week's feature." Sarah replaced the recipe card carefully. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, scaling up production, training new staff, maintaining quality while growing. But tonight, she allowed herself to savor this moment. Sweet Beginnings had lived up to its name. What had started as an escape route had become a destination, and Sarah Mitchell was exactly where she wanted to be. The May rain misted against the windows of Sweet Beginnings' new storefront in Pike Place Market. Sarah arranged the morning's display, the scent of freshly baked cookies mingling with the aroma of nearby flower stalls and coffee shops. The bell above the door chimed, and she called out her usual greeting without looking up. "Welcome to Sweet Beginnings. I'll be right with—" The words died in her throat. David stood just inside the door, looking smaller than she remembered. His designer suit hung loose on his frame, and gray had crept into his temples. For a moment, Sarah's hands trembled, muscle memory from almost 2 years of pain. "Hello, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying none of its old confidence. "Your shop. It's impressive." Sarah straightened, unconsciously adjusting her chef's coat. The crisp white uniform felt like armor now, emblazoned with the Sweet Beginnings logo Emma had designed. "Thank you. What brings you here, David?" He shifted uncomfortably, glancing around at the warm, inviting space she'd created. Copper mixing bowls gleamed on open shelves, and a chalkboard listed the day's specialties in Tyler's precise handwriting. "I've been seeing articles about your success. The kids mentioned the store opening." Of course. The kids. They still saw him every other weekend, though those visits had grown increasingly sporadic. "They're at school," she said, her voice neutral. "Tyler has a science fair today. He's presenting his experiment on how different sugars affect cookie texture." "I know," David replied quickly. "I mean, I was planning to go, but—" He trailed off, and Sarah noticed the shadows under his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. Something was wrong. "Jessica left," he blurted out. 3 months ago. Took everything. I've been struggling." The old Sarah would have felt vindicated, maybe even pleased. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that success was the best revenge. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said, and meant it. "Would you like a coffee? We serve a local roast now." David's eyes widened at her composure. "Sarah, I've been thinking, maybe we were too hasty, seeing everything you've built, how well you're doing. Maybe we could—" "No." The word came out soft but firm, like a kitchen timer announcing that something was done. "David, I need to prep for the morning rush. Marcus will be here soon with fresh deliveries, and I have a meeting with our Whole Foods representative at 10. She watched understanding dawn in his eyes. The woman he'd left behind, the one he deemed inadequate, had vanished. In her place stood a business owner, a leader, a mother who'd turned tragedy into triumph. "Right," he said, backing toward the door. "Of course. I just thought—" "I know what you thought," Sarah replied, turning back to her display. "But I'm not a backup plan, David. I'm not anyone's second choice anymore." The bell chimed again as he left. Sarah allowed herself one deep breath, inhaling the comforting scent of vanilla and possibility. Through the window, she could see the line of regular customers already forming, waiting for their morning treats and coffee. Life had moved on. So had she. 3 weeks after David's visit, Sarah found herself in an unfamiliar position, being interviewed for a women's business magazine. The journalist, a sharp-eyed woman named Alicia, sat across from her in the Sweet Beginnings office, recorder on the table between them. "So, Sarah," Alicia began, "your story has captivated a lot of people. From stay-at-home mom to successful entrepreneur in less than 2 years. How did you do it?" Sarah glanced at the wall behind Alicia, where photos of her journey hung. The first showed her and the kids in their home kitchen, covered in flour and laughing. The latest was from the Whole Foods launch, all 3 of them standing proudly in front of a massive display of Sweet Beginnings cookies. "Honestly," Sarah said, turning back to Alicia, "one day at a time, and with a lot of help." As she recounted the story, Sarah realized how far they'd come. She told Alicia about the late nights experimenting with recipes, the farmers' markets where they'd gotten their first real customers, the leap of faith in renovating the garage. It wasn't just me, Sarah emphasized. Tyler became our unofficial quality control manager. Emma's designs gave us an identity. And then there's Marcus, our first employee, who's now our head baker. Alicia nodded, jotting notes. And your ex-husband? I understand he recently tried to reconnect. Sarah paused, considering her words carefully. The office window overlooked Pike Place Market, bustling with tourists and locals alike. Life went on, no matter what personal dramas unfolded. He did, she said finally. But I realized something important. My worth isn't defined by someone else's recognition of it. After the interview, Sarah walked through the kitchen, where Marcus was training 2 new bakers. The air was thick with the scent of chocolate and warmth. One of the trainees, a young woman named Ava, looked up nervously from her mixing bowl. I think I messed up the proportions, Ava admitted, her voice shaky. Sarah smiled, remembering her own early disasters. Let's look at it together, she said, moving to Ava's station. Sometimes mistakes lead to the best discoveries. That evening, as Sarah reviewed the monthly financials, Emma burst into the office, waving her phone. Mom, you have to see this. It was an Instagram post from a local influencer, praising not just Sweet Beginnings cookies, but their story. The comments section was filled with women sharing their own stories of starting over, of finding strength they didn't know they had. Sarah scrolled through the comments, a lump forming in her throat. I never thought, she began, then stopped, overwhelmed. Emma hugged her mother tightly. You're not just making cookies, Mom. You're giving people hope. Later that night, after closing up the shop, Sarah took a walk along the waterfront. The Puget Sound stretched out before her, ferries crisscrossing under a sky painted in sunset hues. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the pain, the fear, but also the unexpected joys. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. Made a new recipe, lemon poppy seed with a twist. You'll never guess the secret ingredient. Sarah smiled, typing back, Can't wait to try it. You're becoming quite the innovator. As she walked back towards Pike Place, the market quieting for the night, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. Sweet Beginnings had become more than just a business. It was a testament to resilience, to the power of starting over. And maybe, just maybe, it was inspiring others to find their own new beginnings. The lights of her shop glowed warmly in the twilight, a beacon of hope in the heart of Seattle. Sarah Mitchell, once lost, had found her way home. 2 years to the day since David's text message had shattered her world, Sarah stood in the kitchen of Sweet Beginnings' second location. The morning sun streamed through the windows, highlighting the bustling activity of her growing team. Marcus, now the head baker, was training 2 new employees, while Emma, on summer break from high school, handled the front counter with natural charm. Tyler burst through the kitchen doors waving a tablet. Mom, you have to see this. We just got featured in Forbes Women in Business. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron, taking the tablet. The article title read, Sweet Success, How One Woman Turned Heartbreak into a $1 Million Enterprise. The photo showed her in the original kitchen, laughing with her children, all 3 of them covered in flour but radiating confidence. As she read, memories of the past 2 years flooded back. The text message that had shattered her world, the nights spent crying, the first tentative steps toward rebuilding. Each memory now felt like a stepping stone rather than a stumbling block. Mrs. Mitchell? One of the new bakers approached, holding a tray of perfectly baked lavender shortbread. These are ready for your approval. Sarah smiled, remembering her own early days of nervous uncertainty. Call me Sarah, she said, taking a cookie. And these are perfect. You've got a natural talent. Later that afternoon, Sarah sat in her office, reviewing plans for their 3rd location. A frame on her wall held the original recipe card for her grandmother's cookies, now the foundation of an empire built on determination and love. Emma knocked softly before entering. Dad called, she said. He wanted to know if you'd reconsider his investment offer. Sarah shook her head, unsurprised. David had been trying to buy his way back into their success for months. Some things aren't for sale, she replied, including our peace of mind. Emma settled into the chair across from her mother's desk. You know what's funny? I used to think Dad leaving was the worst thing that could happen to us. But now we know it was just the beginning, Sarah finished. Sometimes the things that break us open are the things that let the light in. Through the office window, she could see Tyler teaching a customer about their new gluten-free line, his natural business sense shining through. Her children had grown, not despite their challenges, but because of them. They'd learned resilience, entrepreneurship, and the power of turning pain into purpose. Sarah touched the locket at her neck, a gift to herself on the day Sweet Beginnings had opened its second location. Inside was a tiny photo of her children and a simple inscription. The best revenge is living well. But it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about legacy, about showing her children and herself that life's greatest chapters often come after its hardest breaks, that success isn't measured in dollars or accolades, but in the strength to keep rising, to keep believing, to keep becoming. Sarah Mitchell had lost a husband but found herself, and in the end, that was the sweetest beginning of all. I really hope you enjoyed the story. Please leave a comment with your views. I'm sure there will be new videos on this channel that will thrill you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our next videos. Until next time.